Windows Application Development with Microsoft's .NET Framework 4. Hi, I'm Don Jones, and the content in this series of Nuggets is intended to align with the skills you need to successfully complete Microsoft's 7511 exam, Windows Application Development with Microsoft .NET Framework 4. So let's kind of briefly cover what we're going to cover. We're going to start with an intro and some prerequisites, and that's what we'll do right in this nugget after I kind of run through all of the other things we're going to cover. Nugget number 2 will focus on Windows Forms and Windows Presentation Framework, the two sort of main approaches to creating a Windows application in .NET Framework. In Nugget number 3, we'll talk about selecting controls and implementing a screen layout. So we're going to kind of focus on some of the more common controls and how to actually manage them and put them together to make an application screen layout. Number 4 will be managing styles, themes, and reusable resources, so ways of kind of changing the appearance of your app. And in number 5, we're going to look at creating animation in the Windows Presentation Framework. Nugget number 6 will be WPF events and commanding. And in Nugget number 7, we'll get into user-defined controls and WPF control templates. Nugget number 8 will actually be a little bit of fun. We'll get to play with graphics and multimedia content. And then in number 9, we'll move on to WPF data, event, and property triggers. In Nugget number 10, we'll be working on data binding, including hierarchical data binding and implementing data-bound controls. And at this point, you should have noticed that there's going to be a slight emphasis on Windows Presentation Framework. That's something that we'll talk about a little bit more in Nugget number 2, kind of the differences between Windows Forms and WPF and why this exam is going to focus so much on WPF. So Nugget number 11 will be value converters and data validation, very important in an application, making sure that the data you get is the data you expected. Nugget number 12 will be integrating Windows Forms and Windows Presentation Framework in an application. Number 13 will be asynchronous processing and threading. We'll move on in number 14 to globalization and localization. Globalization being the techniques necessary to create an application that can be localized. In other words, an application that can be more easily translated into different languages so that people in different cultures or countries can use the application a little bit more natively. Nugget number 15 will be drag and drop operations. 16, of course, will be security, because you can't have a Microsoft technology that does not, in some fashion, have something to do with security. So we'll talk about things like software restriction policy, full trust versus partially trusted security, and topics like user account control, which is now present, of course, on Windows Vista and Windows 7, and is something that you as an application developer are going to have to deal with. In 17, we'll be talking about managing user and application settings, and then in 18, how to implement a Windows Presentation Framework test strategy. And when your testing reveals a bug, you'll be able to move right on to Nugget number 19, WPF debugging. And we'll include some tools like the WPF visualizer and presentation trace sources in that nugget. Finally, our last nugget will be deployment options. And we'll talk about things like click once, Windows installer, as well as some of the security settings you're going to have to be aware of for deployment. So before we go on, let's just cover some basic prerequisites. Now, this series is designed to help you understand how to build a graphical user interface application for Windows using version 4 of the .NET Framework and Visual Studio 2010. You're going to use both of Microsoft's major GUI frameworks, Windows Forms and Windows Presentation Framework, or WPF, although, as you've seen, there's going to be an emphasis on WPF, as it's kind of the newer, a little bit more modern way of creating a GUI. You're going to learn to build and enhance the user interface. You'll manage data at the user interface layer. So this is not going to be about database programming, but how to manage the data once it's in front of the user. You'll learn to enhance the functionality and usability of an application and to create a stabilized solution that you can then release. Now, before viewing this series, you should already have a good understanding of either C# or Visual Basic. Microsoft's 7511 exam does not test language-specific skills. You're actually able to take the exam in whichever of those two programming languages you prefer. The exam focuses on technologies in the .NET framework rather than on a specific programming language. Now, the exam and this series kind of does assume that you have some understanding, or at least some of the basics for object-oriented programming in the .NET framework. So you should kind of have that understanding already. And that includes concepts like classes, inheritance, object instantiation, properties, methods, and so forth. Those are all background concepts that we're not going to cover in this series, but you are going to need to have them to make sense. Now, you should also have some pretty good comfort in Visual Studio 2010. If you don't, you can go up to Microsoft.com/Visual Studio, and you can download a full trial of any of the editions of Visual Studio. In this series, you're going to see me primarily focusing on the Professional Edition, but there's also Ultimate and several other editions, and there are some free Express editions. And for the vast majority of what we're going to do in this series, the Express edition in your preferred language, either C# or VB, should be more than enough to cover everything that we're going to need to cover. That way, if you want to practice some concepts, maybe follow along a little bit, maybe at the end of each nugget kind of go in and play with the features and technologies that we just discussed, one of the Express editions should be fine. Those aren't trials. Those are actually complete non-expiring. They're just dumbed down a little bit. And each edition of Express only supports a particular language, like C# or VB. And again, you can get a trial of any of the big versions if you don't have those. So I'm ready to get started. Hopefully you are too. Let's jump in and do some GUI stuff.